When talking about video game history, it's easy to get wrapped up in the consoles, the games, and the rivalry between companies. But behind it all are thousands of talented people, and it's those people that make the games, the consoles, and even the companies happen. But none of them can match Shigeru Miyamoto, whom can be credited with laying the foundations for modern gaming. However, it was just a simple twist of fate that he became involved in gaming in the first place. Shigeru Miyamoto began his relationship with Nintendo long before the company had any interest in the video game industry. It was Miyamoto's father that got Shigeru his interview with Nintendo, at the time a small-time manufacturer of toys and games. Because of his father's connections, Miyamoto-san was hired as an apprentice in the planning department. He ended up acting as the company's resident artist before long and even did art for Nintendo's very first video game, a humble title called Sheriff. Not long after that, he helped program Radar Scope and moved on to the legendary Donkey Kong, which would be his first major imprint on gaming. After that, he moved on to such important titles as Super Mario Bros., The Legend of Zelda, F-Zero, Star Fox, and Super Mario 64, each one spawning massive numbers of imitators and laying the groundwork for gaming as we know it today. But what would happen if Miyamoto never became involved with Nintendo? How would the gaming landscape change? Would gaming even exist as a mainstream medium? Find out as we take another look at gaming history altered. The year is 1981, and things aren't looking so good for Nintendo's video game division. The Radar Scope was a modest success in Japan, but a disaster abroad. The follow-up would be a tired Pac-Man clone that failed to capture much success. By the end of 1982, Nintendo closes their video game division and focuses on electronic toys for the Japanese market, a niche that they continue to fill to this present day. The company would never return to gaming. Miyamoto's Donkey Kong was easily the key to Nintendo's early success, both in the East and the West. Without Donkey Kong, Nintendo would put out some lackluster games, kind of like Radar Scope. And, well, after less than optimal success, they would easily go back to what they were doing before, with quite a bit more success. Meanwhile, in America, Atari initiates the video game crash of 1983 with E.T. and Pac-Man, while the ColecoVision launches to little fanfare and is quickly forgotten. When the smoke clears, the American video game industry is decimated, never to return. The worst case scenario of all occurs. Video games never return to America. Arcades and computer games, the survivors of the crash, slowly wither and die as more and more clones and subpar games make it to market. I'm not saying that video games as a whole cease to be, just the industry. By the 90s, it's the domain of computer geeks, trading homebrews or pirated Japanese games over BBS servers. It evolves into an underground movement by the late 90s, with again only the geekiest of people being interested. By the mid-2000s, gaming is becoming a hipster thing, with people getting Japanese hardware and games as kind of a counterculture movement. Even at present, it's all but ignored by the masses, seeming completely alien to them. The ColecoVision easily was propelled by its launch title, Donkey Kong. Without it, there's little chance that it would have done well at all, even with its advanced specs. So, there you have it on that one. As far as the American video game industry completely dying off, I know this is definitely one of the more controversial things in this episode, especially since I've actually gone on several videos already explaining how it probably wouldn't happen. But this is a little different. In those past gaming history altered episodes, the Japanese video game industry was mostly unaffected by the events. This time, as you're about to see, Japan doesn't get off quite as easily, and there'll be very few, if any, companies willing to take the plunge over to the West again. But now our focus returns to Japan, where Sega, Namco, and Taito are still creating entertaining arcade machines, and Sega and Casio have released home consoles, the SG-1000 and the PV-100 respectively. Sega's machine does well due to the company's arcade hits and quickly outsells Casio's machine. Home conversions are king until 1986, when Japanese gaming changes forever. Sega and Casio's consoles were outright destroyed by the Nintendo Famicom. However, without the Famicom in existence, these two machines would actually have a chance to thrive. As far as the types of games, well, you have to keep in mind that before the NES era, the games released in Japan were really not any different than the games released in the West. They were all simple action games. One single game is responsible for changing gaming forever in the East, and that is Dragon Quest, released this time on the SG-1000. While role-playing games existed previously, the user-friendly approach and colorful graphics and enemies captivate the island nation in a way unseen since Space Invaders almost a decade earlier. Sega also released as a successor to the SG-1000, dubbed the Mark III, which wows gamers with advanced graphics and sound. Of course, it wouldn't take long for that to be upstaged, however. The Sega Mark III, also known as the Master System to us Westerners, was rushed to completion so Sega could have a console that had an edge over the Famicom tech-wise. Well, without that type of competition, Sega doesn't necessarily need to rush the Mark III out this time. And as far as Dragon Quest, well, it did take the island nation by storm. In fact, so much so that by the time Dragon Quest III released, everyone in the nation basically took a day off to play it. I'm not even kidding. People didn't show up for work, people didn't show up for school. The entire nation grinded to a halt for the release of a video game. A7 saw the first obstacle in Sega's dominance in the form of NEC's PC Engine. The console was much more powerful than Sega's Mark III, prompting them to begin work on a successor. However, Sega was in no real danger as Dragon Quest II hits their SG-1000 console, becoming a nationwide phenomenon. A slightly enhanced port was also brought out on the Mark III, selling that console in previously unseen numbers. The first wave of Dragon Quest clones flooded the market, setting up the foundations for the modern JRPG genre. In 1988, NEC released a CD add-on for the PC Engine, and the system's popularity skyrocketed as a result. The reason? Storage space. We remember CD-ROM gaming as that awkward time when developers tried to cram crappy movies onto disc and add a minute amount of interactivity to them. In Japan, where RPGs are king, a CD meant much more space for longer, more involved stories, with more robust soundtracks and impressive cutscenes. They also were cheaper to manufacture for game companies, so it turned out to be a win-win situation for NEC. The PC Engine becomes a serious threat to Sega almost overnight, but they still hold on to the top spot due to the exclusive release of Dragon Quest III on the Mark III. The game breaks all existing sales records for any video game yet. In 1989, the long-delayed Sega Mega Drive makes it to market. And this is an entirely different machine than the real-life version, however. Spec-wise, it's much more powerful, almost on par with the real-life Super Famicom, only with a much faster processor. Second, it had a built-in CD-ROM drive, the major reason for the delay. Finally, the controller sported a joystick. In fact, all controllers still use joysticks, even NEC's. The Mega Drive whooped the PC Engine CD combo in every way, and was slightly less expensive. NEC pretty much had no hope against it at that point, especially with the two most popular JRPG franchises, Phantasy Star and Dragon Quest, being exclusive to Sega's machines. Still, NEC manages a meager share of the market and starts working on a successor. Let's face it, the only reason the PC Engine did as well as it did in our timeline is the simple fact that it actually had the CD-ROM add-on. Without it, it wouldn't have stood a chance. Now, with Sega already in the midst of developing a console at that point, after seeing the success NEC was having with it, there is no reason in the world they wouldn't push that back to make sure they had that CD tech built in. The early 1990s were an interesting time, as the successor to the PC Engine, the PCFX, brought about the advent of the 32-bit generation and outclassed the Mega Drive power-wise. Sega, on the other hand, enjoyed rampant success, especially after they teamed up with electronics giant Sony to create a next-generation successor to the Mega Drive, which stood in development until 1993, where it hit as the first console to really push 3D gaming. This console would be known to all as the Sega Jupiter. Also, the Game Gear took Japan by storm, becoming the first modern portable game system. In order to actually get the form factor right, Sega used gaming's first D-pad, as a joystick would be too bulky. Well, it's hard to imagine today with the PlayStation line out there. Sony used to not have any interest in the video game console industry, especially in releasing their own console. Rather, they were content to develop tech for other companies. It was Nintendo that screwed them that got them on board with that. But I already did an entire episode on that. With no Nintendo here, however, there's no reason why they would abandon their previous platform. As far as the planetary naming scheme, Sega seriously had that during the 90s. Many of the systems were renamed, some weren't, like the Saturn. With a name as cool as Jupiter, I'm betting they were stuck with that. The Sega Jupiter resembled a cartridge-less Sega Saturn, with an orange and red color scheme like its namesake planet. Its controllers utilized a miniature analog joystick, similar to the N64's. It was also shaped like a real-life Genesis pad, making it one of the few controllers that could be comfortably played without a table or hard surface to set it on. RPGs continued to rely on the tried-and-true JRPG formula, but a few adventurous developers tried more dynamic battle systems, including some of the first true action RPGs. However, in contrast, an action game or sports title was rare, as most Japanese only had eyes for the beloved JRPGs. The only other genre to have a following at this point is the Shurima. Okay, I understand that this is easily one of the most controversial claims in this episode, and I feel I actually have enough facts to kind of back this up. So, even with the wealth of different action games and companies and just various play styles today, you have to think back, how many of them owe their ancestry to a Miyamoto game? And the answer is sadly nearly all of them. Anything that's from a side-scrolling perspective can trace its ancestry back to either Donkey Kong or Super Mario Bros. And it just kind of spread out from there. And yes, these other companies like Taito, Capcom, etc. did make shooters as well. But you also have to keep in mind that, well, the shooting market is a very niche one. And many of these companies wouldn't have survived long enough to make some of the more prolific titles like Capcom Street Fighter 2. I'm thinking Capcom wouldn't have lived half that long without Mega Man, for example. So that basically also means that Japan's most popular genres, the rhythm games and the fighting games, neither of them were really very likely to exist at that point. So you just kind of have a crapshoot here with only JRPGs being popular and visual novels. The second half of the 90s received the same short generation gaps as NEC and Sega continue upping the ante tech-wise. NEC's third console, the PC Turbo, hits in 1995 and boasts more robust 3D visuals compared to the Jupiter, but less capacity for 2D graphics, pretty similar to the PlayStation in our timeline. It also has its own analog thumbstick, along with force feedback technology, aka rumbling. It's touted as the first 64-bit machine, playing up that fact as a key to victory. Sega fires back in 1996 with the Sega Neptune, a 64-bit machine that just edges out the PC Turbo in 3D graphics while not sacrificing its 2D capabilities. It also used a custom-made proprietary CD format which could store 900 megabytes, 200 more than a CD-ROM. Considering most JRPGs at this point were shipping with 3 to 5 discs, the extra storage capacity was a big deal to developers. The console also sported a teal color scheme that matched its planet once again. NEC fired back at the end of the millennium with the PC Nitro, which is pretty much identical to the Dreamcast spec-wise, and the first to allow internet play. The new millennium turns out to be more the same, with Sega and NEC continuing to play tech leapfrog, while the games themselves very slowly diversify, with more and more freedom being implemented into the games, along with more action, with some starting to resemble games along the lines of Metal Gear Solid, which feels refreshing to the Japanese public oversaturated with every flavor of JRPG imaginable. Innovation is a slow process, and new IPs are few and far between. The only other game genre of note at this point is the visual novel, which enjoys the same level of success it does in our reality. Otherwise, very little of interest happens. Because of the complete dominance of JRPGs, there was little chance of a Japanese company bringing them overseas. Translating all the text in a typical JRPG is an expensive, time-consuming process, and there wouldn't be a very large audience abroad to boot. Thus, unless you could read or speak Japanese, gaming was pretty much out of the reach for Americans. Just the loss of one man can lead to a future radically different than the one we know. The creativity of Miyamoto inspired innovation in his peers, which in turn captivated gamers young and old, worldwide, for generations, and made an industry develop and thrive. Losing that brilliance would leave the gaming landscape a duller, grayer place. One of the worst outcomes possible could come to pass with the loss of one mind. What else could unfold if gaming history were altered? The possibilities are endless. Thanks for watching.